It's
So just as we started, I just want to hear a little bit of your story and your background. So your family was Palestinian. Were you first generation, second generation American, or what's that connection to here?
My father came to the States in 1966 from here. He's an Israeli citizen, so he was born and raised in the Galilee.
Okay.
My mom's Swedish American.
Oh, all right.
So actually, all the women in my family have married men born abroad. The first two generations, my great-grandmother came when she was about 3. My grandmother, and she married a Swede who came when he was 15 or 20. Then my grandmother married my grandfather who came when he was 20, also from Sweden. And then my mother broke the mold and married a Palestinian. And then I married a Palestinian also born abroad.
All right. And so what was the spiritual or religious background to your childhood?
My father is Roman Catholic. My mother is Lutheran. They did not baptize me. This was the 70s and whatever. So I really did not have much of a religious background.
Okay.
In fact, a few years ago when I was going to be the bridesmaid for my cousin's wedding, there was a little bit of hubbub in the village because they knew that I hadn't been baptized. And this was a Roman Catholic wedding, and so they were a little unhappy about that. But I think my cousin chose me because she knew that I am so much out of the circle, because she herself is kind of a radical.
Okay.
So I think she wanted somebody who didn't fit in.
All right.
Yeah.
So tell me what your sense of what did Palestinian identity mean to you when you were a child, and then as you grew up?
You know, I think a lot of it was about politics when I was a kid. I think it was about politics and food and family. Mm-hmm. Which sounds like it covers a lot, but I think as I got older, certainly that sense of what Palestinianness is about has gotten a lot deeper, although it's still a lot about politics, food, and family, kind of unavoidable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you come here when you were a child?
I came when I was every 2 or 3 years, starting when I was about 2. My mother came with me alone because my dad was unable to visit for political reasons.
So your non-Palestinian mother brought you here.
Yeah. Twice, which was, I think, a little bit bold of her, you know? Although, again, that was to inside Israel. So the circumstances there are in some ways easier. Although in the 70s, it wasn't like an American, it wasn't like having your toddler in Connecticut, for example.
Yeah. Have you been here with your father since then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He started coming. He comes almost every year now.
Mm-hmm. So what changed for him that he was able to come back?
Internal political issues, I think. Yeah. I mean, since I was 7, he's been able to come back. So
Okay.
that's, 30, not quite 30 years.
Do you think that your sense of your identity, in fact, you have a kind of a mixed identity, that was part of your attraction to anthropology, or did that play into it, or?
Well, one way I explain my interest in anthropology is my father is so political science oriented. And in fact, most people who look at this conflict are really political science oriented or history oriented. And I think coming here and just getting sort of the glimpses of Palestinian society that I got, hanging out with my cousins playing Uno, which we could play because I spoke enough Arabic to know the colors and the numbers, I realized there was a lot more going on that I felt didn't enter into those political discussions. And so anthropology was sort of my way of investigating kind of everything else,
Right. So let me just find you. There was something you wrote about. It was about how anthropology could inform journalism, right? And you said news media focuses on spectacular events. It doesn't highlight diversity in Middle Eastern societies or explain the political and social processes, or even I would add the human processes or dynamics, that lead up to the events. I mean, I think what we've seen happen now in Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen, I mean, all of this energy that's there, and this energy of young people in particular, I think a lot of Americans are realizing that for all the post 9/11 coverage of the Arab world, the Muslim world, all these phrases that get used, we weren't educated to see those people, to see their longings, to not be shocked by what looks like a democratic uprising.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think there are sort of histories of democratic uprisings in the Middle East that certainly predate this one, and struggles for democracy that absolutely predate this one. I mean, many people in this society would point to the First Intifada as a popular uprising. The struggle for a right to determination, for example, many see as very much akin to a struggle for democracy. We're not, Palestinians here are not struggling for an autocratic state, for example, Yeah, but there are so many preconceptions that go into, Arabs aren't ready for democracy, or Muslims can't handle democracy, or something like this, which is a real shame.
Yeah. So you're, as an anthropologist, you're actually coming at the story, right? The Palestinian story, the Arab story, from that direction of what's going on a human level, a social level.
Yeah, like, for example, being here in the camp, in this refugee camp, some days it's really quiet. And, those are the days that certainly the journalists are not here, right?
Right.
But it's important to be here on those days. First of all, because it's important to understand that the politics of the situation are sometimes about it being deadly calm, really quiet, about the fact that, many of the teenagers, 15 to 20 or so are in prison, for example. Well, that makes for quiet, It's also about being here because, for example, at night, there are still arrest rates. Journalists aren't necessarily here for that either, because obviously they don't usually spend the night, So it's about being here for the quiet times. It's about being here for the things that just sort of erupt and take shape.
Okay. And so describe where we are now.
Right now we're in Lajit Center, which is a youth center organized or established in 2000, and it serves the youth of Aida refugee camp and some other places around here. So it was established by people who used to be members and active members of political parties, who were political prisoners, and then who in the 1990s became more and more disillusioned with the formal political processes and decided that if they wanted to do something to help their community, to build something for the new generation, they were going to have to start from, sort of the level of the street. So actually, before they had this really nice center set up, they did activities in the street. And then...
like what?
I think they started with things like, they started right before the Second Intifada. So one of the things they wanted to do was have a scout troop that would go out and walk in the mountains and stuff like this. That became impossible during the Second Intifada.
But that's kind of like civil society, right?
Civil society, exactly, right? Now, we have a Dubka troupe, which is a dance troupe. Okay. We have a library, a computer lab. We have a media center that does all kinds of media making. We have fantastic photography program. We have documentary, short documentary production, digital storytelling. So there's just sort of a lot of stuff going on here, and a lot of kids passing through. And I think some of it is about all those concrete things that we make, like cool little documentary films. But a lot of it's just about having this space for kids to come together and also meet people 10 years older than them who can sort of talk to them about their lives in a way that their parents and teachers maybe don't.
And this is in the, you say Aida or Ada? Aida refugee center. So describe the refugee camp for me.
Aida refugee camp is the mid-sized refugee camp in Bethlehem. There's 3 camps here. Dehesha, which is the biggest, and Aza camp is the smallest, and Aida refugee camp, the middle-sized one. We're right on the border of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So, if you got a good arm, you could throw a stone. If you can get it over the wall, it'll be in Jerusalem. The wall is about, 20, 30, maybe 50 meters from here. Very, very close.
How many people live here?
4,500,
really?
Or about 5,000, something like that. And about, I think, more than half under the age of 18 or 25. I mean, a huge proportion under the age of 18.
And does this date back to 1948 or right after 1948?
Yeah, right after 1948. Yeah.
So I know in some of your work, talking about how journalism is done here and the messages it communicates, you talk about the language and how the language is, even the language of a refugee camp. And this is also an experience I'm having here. These are also communities, right? And as you say, there's a diversity to what a refugee camp looks like, feels like, what happens there. And I mean, I'm experiencing... sometimes it just feels like a neighborhood, right?
Yes.
So I think if Americans have images probably from some kind of natural disaster of a refugee camp, it's makeshift. Whereas these are, as you say, distinct communities and very different communities. I mean, describe how you would talk about, what is a refugee camp, or the range of that.
Well, yeah. So one thing that's very different about this refugee camp compared to many that you hear about in the news is that it's been around for decades, right? Since around 1951. So, it started off with people living in tents. They lived in tents for between 5 and 10 years. And then they built these concrete houses, which were one-room blocks. And then since then, people have built houses and then they've built on top and top and top and top and top, letting each family sort of grow because they don't have any room to expand.
Grow vertically.
Mm-hmm. So, it used to be that every family had this little concrete block house and around it was some land and they used to do a little bit of farming. So people had a few, a lemon tree, an olive tree, little place for vegetables like tomatoes and so forth. But as they had to, sort of build out, all of that land was taken up. Now there's almost no sort of even tiny bit of open space in the camp. So that's, one characteristic of the camp. The other thing is that each of the camps, even in the West Bank, have different characteristics. If you go to Balata refugee camp, for example, Balata refugee camp in Nablus, it's so tight that you can easily push your hands out and touch two houses. I mean, that's how small the alleyways are. There's no, there's maybe one way through the whole camp, which is much bigger than this camp, that a car can get through.
Okay.
So this, is a kind of a one of the more comfortable refugee camps, but it's still, overcrowded, has some lack in terms of municipal services. And I mean, the fundamental thing that makes it a refugee camp, of course, is that these are refugees, people who were pushed out of, their villages or their families were pushed out of their villages in 1948, not allowed to return, so dispossessed of their land. Most of these people were, farmers.
Right.
And obviously now they're not.
Mm-hmm. So here's perhaps a stupid question, but so as you also note in your writing, people are not any less free to move around who live in the refugee camp than other citizens of Bethlehem, right? It's not like they're locked inside the refugee camp. Could people move? Could people move out, decide to leave?
They could.
Okay.
Yeah, people do, certainly. If they can, save money to buy land or, rent.
So they could take
outside.
a job somewhere and have enough money then to rent an apartment somewhere else.
And then they would still, of course, be refugees and they would still have the right to return.
They still have refugee status.
Yeah,
okay.
They still have refugee status.
But is part of what holds these communities together a collective will to move as a community back? Is that
Yes.
the idea, the kind of vision that holds it, that keeps it together as a unit?
Well, I mean, I think that's what keeps together refugee identity as a whole together. But I mean, why are people still in the camp? The real reason people are in the camp is because they actually can't necessarily easily go out and buy land and build. I mean, So in a way, the politics. Certainly there is sort of a political community here in the camp, a cluster of people who care about the same kinds of things and so on and so forth. But that's not to say that once you move, you lose that.
Right,
I mean, I think there is anxiety about that. Nidal's, my husband's sister, is building a house, and it's going to be really beautiful, and it's on a piece of land, and, it's really lovely. And they're almost ready. In fact, they've bought the furniture about a year ago.
Are they living here now?
Yeah, they live in the camp.
Okay.
And they bought the furniture a year ago. It's been sitting in the warehouse or something because they're not ready to move to the new house. Now, the sort of stated reason is they're waiting for this road to get paved so that it'll be easy for them to come and go to their new house.
Right.
But the truth is, they could have moved up there, I think they're reluctant in some way to leave the camp.
And do you live here?
I live in Beit Jala,
Okay.
right next to the camp.
Okay.
Yeah, it's easier to rent in Beit Jala than in the camp because in the camp it's overcrowded, first of all, so there's not much empty space. And if there is an empty apartment, it's really part of a family setup, so you'd be kind of joining an extended family.
Right.
And there wasn't quite room in my own family, my husband's family. And so we decided to rent outside.
Okay. Now, how long have you been married? Just
About 5 years.
5 years. But did you start coming here as a researcher before you were married?
Oh, yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
When
How did you first start coming here as a researcher?
So I came for the long period of my research in 2003 to work on this PhD research on the production of U.S. news about Palestinians.
And the Second Intifada was underway, all of that was going on?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you could say that the absolute worst of it was behind us.
Okay. 2002.
But it was certainly going on.
So I'd like to talk about that, about what you're doing. You're I don't know if this was the project where you're asking Palestinians to translate and critique U.S. news articles about them.
That's a very
and about
small
the
part.
Second Intifada in particular. So who do you talk to then?
So that was a very small part of this research project.
Okay.
Most of it was about sort of looking at journalistic collaborations. So, for example, Palestinian journalists that work with U.S. journalists as
Right,
cameramen
like
and
we have.
fixers and reporters and so forth. Yeah, looking at those kinds of collaborations, which are obviously cross-cultural collaborations that make a huge difference for the possibility of producing American news, right? But that are completely kind of erased.
Well, and so, I just want to name this because, I feel like in a way this whole conversation I'm having with you is so basic, but it's this basic information that people don't know that, as you say, doesn't get covered with spectacular headlines,
right.
Or big news events. So I think, I'm getting to understand that there may be, one of the world's highest per capita proportions of journalists to citizens here, foreign journalists to citizens.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And you're right. So people come, and we have someone working with us who is indispensable. We couldn't do this without a fixer. You have Palestinian fixers, journalists, producers, reporters, who work intimately with all these Western journalists, right? And not just getting you around and helping make do scheduling, but translating, and also to a certain extent directing. Because I think there's this phrase that's come up since we've been here. There are no facts here, right? There are so many different ways to look at any fact, or to interpret it or state it. And so you also start, you see through someone's eyes, and depending on who we're with, we're seeing the same phenomenon very differently.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right. So that was exactly what I sort of came to look at. Because, in the United States, it's easy to see a news headline, for example, with a byline, and that byline is usually an American name, and imagine that that's the person who kind of did all of this all by herself, for example.
Yeah. In fact, it takes a village.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? And that's very interesting, because sometimes Palestinian journalists are criticized for being only nationalist and so on and so forth. And I was trying to paint a much more complex picture of why do Palestinian journalists do the work that they do? Many of them did get into it because they care about politics, but also, it's certainly it's a pretty good paycheck, particularly during the Second Intifada.
It's interesting work too. It's not just that it's probably can be actually reliable work and good work and valuable work.
I think exactly what you said about it being interesting is absolutely critical, because, I have a friend who is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and she's a journalist. And, Palestinians who are inside Israel, they don't get to come to the West Bank that much, right? They don't have a reason to, and they don't, usually there's a lot of separation between these two communities, Palestinians inside Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank. And I can tell from the way she talks about her work, because she's a journalist, that one of the things she loves about her work is that she knows Nablus and Jenin. It
brings her to these places.
Yes, she knows every little village practically. And she has contacts there, and that's what makes it valuable for her. These connections are very dear in this time of fracture, and that's what this is. This is a time of incredible fracture, splintering, separation.
Well, and that's so interesting that these people who are actually working, and I think this is also what you're getting at, the impact of the internal effect of this, because that these people who are in fact working, who live in this land, but who are working with journalists coming in from the outside, then become part of webs of relationship that actually defy some of those headlines.
Exactly, right? Because the headlines can be, of course, very polarizing, and yet sort of the things that actually produce those headlines are all about networks and connections, And I think, for example, this journalist, some of the things that, even if she's making news that she doesn't agree with, sort of the narrative that comes out of it, she's come out of it with her relationships and her own experiences, and that's very valuable.
So here's the way you said this. So journalists, it's not just that journalists come in and they're working with people on the ground. They're getting quotes from Palestinians, right? And then you say, although these Palestinians' words are transported all over the world, they tend not to come home to roost. So in that, I suppose there's a disconnect between the impression that they may be making in the outside world, and then I don't know. And should they? Do you think there should be more of a loop back?
Well, some of these journalists that I spoke to, Palestinians who work with foreign correspondents, said, one of the downsides of my work is that when I used to work for Palestinian media, everybody knew me. My headline my byline was there, every day or something like this. And now nobody knows my name, but they said, okay, this is a compromise I'm worth, I'm willing to make because I think what I'm doing is valuable. Do I think that circle should happen more is really an interesting question. I mean, obviously, I think, it's okay to have news that's geared towards an American audience that Americans are reading, It's not practical for Palestinians to sit around reading all the news that's written about them. They have other things to do, right? But on the other hand, I think it's good to sort of create some of these dialogues. And, I would say this center is like a second home to me. I mean, every time I come here, I stay in a different apartment that we find and we rent. But every time I come back here and I see the same, many of the same people, and they're a little bit, especially the young ones are getting a little bit older, and it's very exciting. I mean, I've known some of these people now, and I almost say kids, but I mean, I've known them for 8 years. So they were kids and they're not anymore. And it's really exciting. And so spending time here, I realize, there's a lot of voices that never make it into international media. And it's really important for us to hear those voices, right? Non-elite voices, people who have something to say about their own political experiences, but don't get the chance to say it, and Americans don't get the chance to hear it. So creating those dialogues is what I was trying to do.
So if I asked you, what are the Palestinian stories you wish were being told? You long to be covered, to be truly covered. What comes to mind? Well,
some things like I think refugee stories, stories about loss and about distance. I mean, for example, many of the refugees living in this refugee camp, they could walk to their villages in about an hour if there wasn't a wall in the way, and if it was legal. I mean, that's a really intimate relationship with a place that's completely taken out of their lives in a physical sense. I mean, they're really close and they know it, and yet they can't get there, right? So those are some of the stories. I think stories of villages, you don't get, that much. Stories about agriculture, about growing things in this land and what that means to people.
Of thriving villages or just functioning villages.
Functioning, right? Getting by, getting by on, raising, just now it's the season of what they call zahar baladi. It's like a kind of cauliflower that's local. It's a little bit yellow if you see it in the markets. It takes 9 months to grow.
Oh, I've seen that. It grows that yellow?
It grows yellow.
Oh, I thought it was pickled or something. Oh.
And it takes 9 months to grow. You put a seed in the ground in May and you harvest it in February. And it doesn't require any irrigation water. And that's why it's grown here. That's one of the reasons it's grown here, So, I mean, you think about, I just had a baby, right? So, a cauliflower that takes 9 months to grow, is really lovely. And they taste better and people really enjoy that, So, yeah, thinking about some of those stories. Now, I'm not saying that American audiences have to hear these stories. Obviously, nobody needs to hear about this nice cauliflower.
They're stories of life.
Yes.
Whereas the stories we hear are of destruction and death, honestly.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, I want to come back to even a term like refugee. There's a reality to that deserves expression, right? But I think that the language of refugee, especially in an American ear where that experience is so foreign these days. Maybe not a couple hundred years ago, but now. It is the language of victimhood. And I don't experience the whole Palestinian reality, the human reality, to be one that's just victimhood, right?
I'm happy to hear you say that. Because a few years ago, I think for a journalist coming here, one might have been bombarded by stories of victimhood. So in a way, I'm really happy to hear you come here and, hear that you've come here and say that, actually there's a lot more going on. I think that's great.
What I'm not saying is that there's not a tragedy that's real, right?
Right.
And there's not suffering that's real, but that's different from saying we are only victims, right?
Well, I think people would say, refugee is not just a language of victimhood, it's also a language of rights. I think people would be very clear about that,
Okay. Yeah.
It's about a right to return. It's about a right to, go back to the villages where our grandfathers were born. I think many people would say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I still don't think it as the only defining word on a human being, they are a refugee. It's not enough.
No.
Even if, as you say, the word itself holds, it's necessary, but it's one descriptor. You know what I'm getting at?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a political identity. You know, I mean, Americans don't walk around necessarily thinking, I'm a citizen, right?
Right.
But that's sort of what, I mean, and I would say,
Right.
like,
And
being a
so,
refugee is like
you're a
that.
citizen and you're a parent and you're somebody's child and you do this for a living and you write and you have these thoughts, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's very true here as well.
I mean, honestly, I also am feeling a lot of these descriptors. Refugee camp, for example. This is a place where people live. It's a neighborhood, and there are different kinds of neighborhoods, in addition to being a refugee camp with those restrictions. I also feel like the language of settlements obscures the reality of, when you see these settlements. I think both a refugee camp and a settlement, I'm talking about the Israeli settlements, Americans might imagine tent cities in both cases.
Huh, interesting.
And not, the settlements are these gleaming, they look like suburban condominium developments, right? So I'm just saying I'm very intrigued by how I think the language, even some of the really basic vocabulary, obscures the story.
Yeah. It's like we need to just keep on unpeeling the layers of what these words mean and what they mean to different people. So, for example, in Bethlehem, if you ask somebody, if you just run into somebody on the street and, ask them what their impression of a refugee camp is, it's going to be very similar to if you, depending on who you stop on the street, if you ask, sort of a person who's not a camp resident, doesn't have friends and family there, they're going to think of it maybe in some of the similar terms that if you stop somebody in Manhattan and ask them about what the South Bronx is like,
Right.
Yeah. So these places have a lot of different connotations.
Yeah. So I want to just give some examples of some of what you learned and got out of your research. There was the example of how Arafat's funeral was covered and described. Why don't you just tell that story of different ways Palestinians experienced that coverage?
So Arafat's funeral...
set the scene, too. Okay.
Yeah, you may remember it was... Okay, so Arafat had been sort of besieged in this compound for 2 years or so. I may actually be getting that number wrong. And eventually... he became ill and he was finally allowed to leave. Basically, Israeli authorities had threatened him. If he leaves the compound, something will happen, right? So he leaves, he goes to Paris for treatment, and dies. In Paris, they had, kind of a military funeral or some kind of a sort of diplomat's funeral for him. In Egypt, the same kind of a thing. Then he comes back here for, his
body
final
flown
funeral.
back here?
His body is flown back here, right? In sort of preparation, Palestinians hear that he's passed away and that he's going to come, his body's going to be brought back here for burial. People came sort of from all these different cities, came into Bethlehem to be part of this event. They came into Ramallah to be part of this event, right? So I have friends here from Bethlehem who walked most of the way over the desert hills to get to this funeral, right? And when they got there, the Muqata, the Arafat's headquarters, which is where he was going to be buried, is this sort of big open square, right? Now, Arafat had wanted to be buried in Jerusalem, but that was impossible. Israeli authorities were not going to allow that. So instead, they said they're going to have a temporary burial in the Muqata, which is the same place where he was besieged for years before his death. Okay. Doesn't sound that nice, right? So, and in addition, like I said, there's this big open space. And according to the Palestinian authorities, they're going to, have dignitaries there and they're going to, put him into the ground. And then after that, they're going to allow for a receiving line to pass by it. Okay. Well, the problem with that is that's not a Palestinian funeral at all. A Palestinian funeral is taking a body through the streets, usually from, the mosque or from the center of the town out to a cemetery, right? It involves a lot of people, hundreds of people walking behind. And for somebody like Arafat, obviously, thousands, tens of thousands of people wanted to participate. Okay, so down come the helicopters landing in the Muqata, in this open space. And already there are Palestinians sort of literally standing on the walls of this compound. And I was standing on a roof nearby, overlooking the whole thing. There's people everywhere. Every inch of the ground is covered. And it's sort of funny because there's this sort of conspicuous open space. It's like, how is this going to happen? Okay, well, obviously, Palestinians, entered the space. They wanted to be a part of this event. They didn't want to be standing 50 yards away. And, I think there was a fear from the Palestinian authorities that they were going to carry Arafat's body off to Jerusalem, that they were just going to do what they should, what, according to a Palestinian funeral, what you would do, which is to carry a body from one place to the place where, he's meant to rest, right? Obviously, that would have created huge problems at the checkpoint for the Palestinian authorities and for Israeli authorities.
Right.
So that's probably what they're trying to prevent. So anyway, this open space is no longer open. It's full of people, and there's like firing guns in the air, which again is sort of one can interpret as a salute. A lot of people do criticize this firing in the air because it can be dangerous. People do get injured from the bullets when they come back down. So the narrative written about this in the American media was absolutely one of chaos, of danger, of threat, of, the era of Arafat, pervaded during his funeral. We're hoping a new era will be born, which is much more organized and so on and so forth. But right now, this is Arafat's time, and he would have liked the funeral because it was chaotic like him, right? So fawda is the word for chaos, and it's sort of a key word here too. People use it a lot when they talk about politics. And other things, like youth center events, for example. Fawda is a big, important word here. So when I interviewed people about articles written about the funeral, what I did was I had a few key articles about the funeral translated from English into Arabic, and I gave them to a bunch of people to read. And then I did sort of like longish interviews, like, about a short article. And we got into long conversations about this word chaos. And what it meant.
And I was really fascinated. So, for example, one or maybe a couple of people felt like this was a good way to identify something. What was it that they might explain it differently than the journalist, but that it put a finger on something in Palestinian culture as it's evolved, that it's revolutionary as opposed to democratic, which was actually, it seemed like it was an important insight for them to hear it that way.
Right.
And that was one reaction.
Right. That there was never a sort of that things had been too sort of militant and revolutionary and not institutionalized. And if it was institutionalized, then perhaps there could be more stability and so on and so forth, and the funeral would have been more orderly. So there was that critique that some people identified.
Yeah.
And then other people said, no, this was a beautiful chaos, a productive chaos. This was the chaos of people taking back their streets, basically, and trying to take back an event that, in fact, Arafat had been a leader for 40 years or something like this, right? So for them to participate in his funeral is a really important thing, right? So if you think about participation as a key democratic virtue or practice, then in fact, jumping into the middle of that square and trying to participate in the event was, a key democratic thing to do.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I could see it both ways,
So I want to know how... Al Jazeera then what has Al Jazeera added to this dynamic of journalism and also how journalism kind of circles back to Palestinian self-understanding?
Yeah, Al Jazeera has been absolutely critical to remaking the way people think about, or at least the way people are able to receive their news. Palestinian newspapers are not as important at all as Al Jazeera or radio. No, Al Jazeera is absolutely the most popular sort of way people get their news.
So I have to say that I've been watching Al Jazeera English here. I've watched it before, but I'm really watching it a lot now. And to me, it's almost indistinguishable from the BBC. What's surprising me, and I'm assuming that there's a difference between Al Jazeera English and the Arabic service. But for example, there were there was the March 15th demonstration on the streets of Gaza and some other cities, which was a reaction, which was planned in reaction to the uprising in Egypt, and it was a day of unity. But it was, it was number 6 or 7 in the news headlines in Al Jazeera English, which surprised me. Would that be played differently in the Arabic service in what people are watching here?
I didn't get to watch Al Jazeera yesterday because my satellite service was down, unfortunately. But Al Jazeera Arabic is definitely different than Al Jazeera English. And, they have been sort of seen as a political actor, not only in Egypt and Tunis and other places, but here. Just a few weeks ago, there was this Palestine Papers leak of Al Jazeera leaked all these documents of Palestinian negotiators. And partisans from Fatah attacked the Al Jazeera office, because they saw it as critical of them, which it was critical of them. So Al Jazeera is definitely seen as sort of part of the story here.
It's part of the story, and it's political, but not in a predictable or comfortable way. Right?
Not in a comfortable way.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, what is the model of journalism that there's an implicit comparison all the time of, Al Jazeera or any other news media to, some outside objective standard that is the way we should do news. And I think, that model is being questioned in the United States,
Yeah,
and
right.
And it's being done differently here as well, so.
Mm-hmm. Do you see Al Jazeera, and I mean, I'm asking you this also as somebody who's done all the research you've done. Do you see Al Jazeera and also the way Al Jazeera is maturing and evolving, which it is, as reflective of something that's going on in the larger society? Is it part of civil society forming in a different way?
Well, I think one interesting question, particularly about the Palestinian context, is what does it mean to have a really good, really strong satellite news station that has been able to cover governments in a much more critical way than any other outlet has, in Arab media, to do it in a high quality way. These are people who came from BBC Arabic,
yes,
many of them,
yes.
High quality. What does it mean to have that and to still not have high quality Palestinian journalism?
Okay.
It's not enough in a sense to have this.
So it becomes a standard to hold oneself to, maybe.
Not just a standard to hold oneself. Also, what would it mean to have, for example, NPR National doing their stories and not to have any of the local stations doing their reporting?
Okay.
I mean, it's a problem. It's a problem to have it's great to have this excellent satellite station, but there need to be Palestinian news outlets as well.
So it presents a challenge to create a different level of regional journalism.
Yeah, I mean, there's still a gap there.
Yeah.
And that gap continues both because of financial constraints on Palestinian journalism and also because of political constraints on Palestinian journalism. In other words, all the ways that Al Jazeera has been pushing the buttons on Palestinian leaders and so on and so forth has not allowed for Palestinian television and radio and so on and so forth to and internet sources to fully break down those barriers that continue to constrain them. And that's a problem.
It's a problem, but it's the kind of problem that once it's made visible becomes a pressure. Because it puts pressure on the society to create those structures, right?
But it should. But I mean, it's been 15 years, or more.
Yeah.
And I think the thing is that, the PA has become more repressive of journalists and not less. In the last several years. And that's a major problem. I mean, a lot of international donor funding has come in to support Palestinian news organizations, particularly, internet ones and so on and so forth. But still a lot of PA sort of constraints on what happens. You can't have good international news coverage of national stories and expect that to be enough. You also have to have good national coverage of national stories and local coverage of local stories.
I think that analogy of NPR and regional stations is really, really helpful for an American imagination. So I think I just want to finish with asking you about now. Are you living here now? And are you permanently, indefinitely, or
no?
Okay,
6 or 7 months.
How long have you been here? Living here?
6 weeks.
And
like that.
Okay, so your daughter wasn't born here.
No.
Okay. But you are living here and you're living here as a mother, which is your relative. That's a relatively new experience for you. Just tell me how you think about that and what this experience of living here and living here as a mother has maybe added in terms of a layer of your comprehension to this. And also, and I think this question is related. What makes you despair, and what are your sources of hope, being here in the midst of this place?
I have to say that I feel that in every way it's a privilege. I am in a privileged position being here. I am privileged to have a kind of a job that allows me to travel and do in-depth research for months and months. I mean, I'm a university professor on sabbatical, and to do that as a new mother is actually a special privilege. I mean, I have my daughter here, and sometimes she can come on the research trips and see the new spring baby animals, and how fun that is when I go out to check out the cauliflower and I get to take her along, for example, right? And it's a privilege to have her meet her family and get to spend a lot of time with them. I, as an American, am incredibly privileged to be able to move throughout this country as pretty much no one else can.
Right. That's huge, isn't it?
Yeah. Palestinians from the West Bank can't go inside, and Gaza obviously can't. Palestinians from inside Israel don't really come here much.
And Israelis can't move freely in the same way either.
That's right.
Yeah.
They don't move.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about it for me is it's not at all a comfortable privilege. Psychologically, emotionally, even physically, very few people move the way I do. And so there's no infrastructure, for example, to move the way I do, taking these buses and walking and, crossing the checkpoint and hiring cabs and patching a way to go from one place to the other in these routes that very few people are traveling, coming home to tell people about it. It's exhausting and it's uncomfortable, but I'm really, really happy to be able to do it. I think my biggest anxiety in the weeks before I came here with my daughter was, I'm used to being here and I appreciate it very much. And there are small discomforts as well, physical discomforts and so on and so forth, but I'm used to it. I was a little anxious taking my daughter here. One of the things that made me most anxious was to be I just imagined, what is it going to be like for me to be in Jerusalem with all of those armed settler types and my infant daughter, I feel that there's a element of danger there. Maybe it's not a completely rational fear, but why would I want I'm coming from, Massachusetts and, the wonderful cities of Somerville and Cambridge and Massachusetts. It's very, feels very safe and comfortable there. And to come to this place where I have to see my daughter next to an automatic weapon is really makes me very angry. It makes me very sad. It makes me very uncomfortable. So I haven't gotten over that yet. Oh, I took the train with my daughter and I was trying to find a seat where I wouldn't have to be sitting next to a soldier. I took the train with my daughter and it was very strange because that's my main, aside from my experience with family, public transportation is one of my main experiences of Israeli society. So, everybody likes to play with my daughter because she's really fun and
right.
sweet. So there I am in a long train ride, right? And it's not easy, and I'm doing this all by myself because my husband can't go inside Israel. So handling this, very squirmy, active, sweet, 6-7-month-old. And everybody wants to make eyes and Google and play. And I'm hesitant about whether I want her making eyes at the soldiers, Then on the last leg of the journey, I was across the way from two women who I think were Arab, Jewish, gay, poor women. That was how I blocked them out from their appearance. And also they seemed to speak no English and they were speaking all Hebrew. Okay. And I, was anxious about her immune system as a mother is, right? So I didn't want to pass her around to different people. Right. These women were like, give us your baby, give us your baby. I was like, no, I'm not going to give you my baby. It's really nothing personal. I just sort of tried to say nothing because we had no language. So I was like, but anyway, she got so squirmy and so on and so forth. And they just kept on making eyes and smiling. And my daughter was smiling back and I was like, okay, take the baby. So she had a really nice, I think, time with these women. So that was a good connection.
So, I keep hearing from people, I think, again, from the outside, it feels like a situation of total despair and the peace process is locked. And I don't experience people here to be without hope, though. And I almost see people pointing at these weird, these human encounters like that as somehow seeds of what might and must one day come about.
I hope so. The things that give me hope and pleasure here, and I have to say pleasure more than hope, unfortunately, are kind of the things that happen with the people that I care about and the people that I've known for a long time, or meeting a new person who's able to sort of tell me something in a really dynamic, interesting way, getting to enjoy sort of the change of the seasons here is something that I'm often here in the summer, and again, I just feel like it's a tremendous privilege to be here in the winter and the spring and enjoy the cauliflower and then the almonds and then the chickpeas and then there are these things called faous, which is a kind of a cucumber. It's kind of between a cucumber and a squash. I love all these seasons. This is what I take great pleasure in. In terms of hope for long-term politics, I mean, I do hope that things will work, can start to straighten themselves out. On the ground, you don't see so much that is encouraging. I mean, I'm happy to hear a lot of people talking about hope for one democratic secular state or one democratic multicultural state. That gives me hope to hear more and more talk about that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.